Hi, it's Dina. Every week, when Click Here brings you a new story about the people making and breaking our digital world, there's a lot of great material you don't get to hear.
My little boy wants to know what we are doing.
Hello.
Hello.
It was a fun thing, it was a powerful thing, and it was a challenge, which is how things really spiraled out of control.
So, why don't you tell me about that?
Well,
Are you there? Or are we losing connection again?
So if you get into a verbal cul-de-sac, you can just say, "Hey, Dina, let me stop for a second. Let me start again."
Sure. Well, I'm in a cul-de-sac.
I'm sorry. I've just never had anybody come into the cul-de-sac that fast.
So, we thought instead of keeping all this stuff to ourselves, we'd try something a little different. We're calling it Mic Drop. It's a deeper dive into material we didn't have time to cover in the episode that we think you'd love. We have a special guest to kick this off. 1, 2. 1, 2. Okay. One early Sunday morning a couple of weeks ago, I broke out my recording kit to interview someone who doesn't do many interviews. So here's the question you're not expecting, which is, could you introduce yourself to us, please?
I'm Chris Wray, the FBI director.
Okay. I don't know why, but I was expecting a longer answer from him. I was talking to him just weeks after he went up to the Hill.
Thank you, Chairman Gallagher, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and to the members of the Select Committee for inviting me here to testify today.
He was there to talk to Congress about the growing threat in cyberspace, and specifically an FBI operation against a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group called Volt Typhoon. They had dropped malware in key networks attached to our critical infrastructure, things like water, communications, airports.
And let's be clear, cyber threats to our critical infrastructure represent real-world threats to our physical safety.
Days after the government announced that these Chinese hackers were in U.S. critical computer networks, the news got worse. They revealed the group had been lurking there, undetected, for years. And Ray was very candid with me in our rare one-on-one interview about how out of bounds this is, to be in civilian networks like that.
This, to me, is another example of the Chinese government showing its contempt for the rule of law, for norms that the international community holds dear, and we're not going to tolerate it.
After the break, more from Director Wray. We'll be right back. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and this is Click Here's Mic Drop. 2024 is starting out as a banner year for cyber takedowns.
International law enforcement agencies, including here in this country, have cracked a case and
mounted a hackback campaign.
Ran a court-authorized technical operation.
Seized control of the group's site on the dark web.
And just today, we're announcing yet another success.
But cyber operations until recently always had a kind of whack-a-mole feel. Some darknet marketplace or ransomware gang would be taken down one day, only to pop up again somewhere else the next. Now, FBI Director Wray told me, they're doing something that they used to do when I was covering terrorism for NPR.
We're trying to get left of boom.
Left of boom, trying to prevent attacks rather than just to respond to them. The way the FBI started stepping in when ISIS was big, right? Remember, first people would get all the way to ISIS and you'd figure it out. And then there was Minneapolis where you rounded up lots of people before they got on planes. Can we think about this in the same way, that it's sort of before they actually can do the damage, where the FBI is stepping in a preventative way?
Well, obviously there are important differences between terrorism and cyber, not the least of which is the horrific loss of life and bloodshed that is involved in terrorism. And I never want to lose sight of the human cost that's involved there. But there are similarities in terms of how we're trying to approach the threat. And one of them, as you say, is the focus on prevention and disruption. And trying to get to a point where we can interdict the threat before it becomes much more serious.
And he's not just talking about preempting individual cybercriminals or cyber gangs. It's nation-state hackers who tend to do the scarier things.
A key part of battling the cyber threat, especially with nation states, is to detect access and prevent the access from being used in a way that would harm national security, personal security, or some other interest.
Is there a pattern emerging here of a change in the way that cyber fight is being fought?
We're seeing nation states trying to preposition to get persistent access to, in the Volt Typhoon case, critical infrastructure, for example. And so that is not a new thing for intelligence services and adversaries like the Chinese government. We're seeing it now on a scale and intensity that we have not previously seen.
And he said the targets of these nation-state hackers are changing. It isn't just military installations or defense industries, it's us, ordinary citizens. We talked about this in our previous episode. Hackers with the GRU, or Russian intelligence, cracked into the ordinary Wi-Fi routers we have at home or at the office. Shortly after our episode dropped, the FBI and a roster of international law enforcement agencies released an advisory warning people that they may have been targeted.
Russian state-sponsored cyber actors are actively exploiting Ubiquiti edge routers to conduct malicious cyber operations.
The advisory urged people who owned specific kinds of routers to reset them. And it offered instructions on how to ensure that malware wasn't still lurking in their systems. As we mentioned in our story, the routers that the GRU targeted were older ones.
The security updates and patches weren't being received and so forth anymore. So as a result, they found kind of a weak link in the chain and were able to kind of take advantage of it.
Russian military intelligence, the GRU, had used these common routers to launch cyber attacks.
So it shows the ways in which the cyber threat is all kind of interwoven. You can't just look at this sector or that sector or big companies versus small home offices. They're all kind of interwoven, whether targets in their own right or as vehicles to get to other parts of the cyber ecosystem. And that, I think, underscores that for average Americans and average citizens in other countries, it's not just a large company or large utilities network that's at risk. Personal networks are at risk.
Which is the distinction the director was trying to make. This isn't just spy versus spy. Espionage is something nation states do, and that's generally accepted as part of being in the world. What's different here is that adversaries are starting to target civilian infrastructure, power, communications, not just military networks or government agencies. And that's a switch. The U.S. also prepositions themselves inside foreign networks, but inside what they consider legitimate targets, like military or government networks. They call it defend forward. And I asked, what makes defend forward different than what the Chinese hackers were doing?
I mean, I will let NSA and U.S. Cyber Command speak for themselves. They're among our very closest partners, and Paul Nakasone is a dear friend. I think when we testified together in front of the China Committee, in front of the House, as I recall, he testified very explicitly and publicly that we do not target other countries' civilian critical infrastructure like water, like power. And I think he even went so far as to say there's no legitimate purpose for that.
The bright spot in all of this is that battling our adversaries in cyberspace isn't always rocket science. Wray says ordinary citizens can go a long way toward protecting the country by just doing the little things.
Getting the little stuff right, the weaknesses that the Chinese were able to exploit there were fairly simple weaknesses to exploit. And so it's not just black belt level activity that we have to combat. We have to make sure that we're getting the basics right collectively as a country and as an international community.
buy a new router, install those patches, get the little stuff right, and all of us can help prevent these kinds of attacks. From Recorded Future News, this has been Mic Drop. This episode was produced by Sean Powers and Kat Schucknecht. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and we'll be back on Tuesday with an all-new episode of Click Here. Have a great weekend.